Eradication, Part 2. The Iron Crusade. The first bombers were dropped into orbit from a carrier with orders to obliterate a construction yard. They were armored and shielded with the latest Terran military tech, and each carried a payload of two 20-megaton nuclear warheads. The bombers, not ripped apart by guided missiles and fighters, had their payloads rendered useless by tech reminiscent of EMPs or burned away by point defense systems. We scrambled for solutions, but technology scavenged from a wrecked fleet was no comparison to the might of the Shrike military. But tech has no effect on something as dumb as impact-detonated ordnance, and point defense systems' ability to defend is finite. Instead of strategic strikes, the ships were fitted with massive payloads and given new flight plans. Saturation bombing is sure to land at least one explosive past a point defense. Resources in those early days were stretched thin. So thin, we were forced to begin manufacturing aircraft without drive engines, but internal combustion-driven propellers that confined the ships to the atmosphere of the planet. Losses were heavier to enemy aircraft, but they were virtually hidden from missiles and flew below low-orbit point defense systems, allowing the payloads to reach their targets with greater effectiveness. Fighters and anti-aircraft fire claimed nearly 60% casualties every mission. Command called it acceptable losses. The bomber crews called it hell. Trapped in a steel cage while hunters pried at the armor with plasma bolts. But the runs continued, because to hesitate meant a fleet setting its course for Terra. I heard we dropped something like 3.5 million tons of ordnance during the Second World War. We hit that number 3 months into the shrapnel rain. All the while, our dreadnoughts loomed in the deep, lurking on the edge of the black. Herding Shrike fleets away from the FTL lanes, spawning from the darkness to keep them isolated and alone. But the human form is fragile, and incessant jumps began to play with the minds of the crews and wither the bodies of the jumpers. A suicide is easily explained. Entire gun crews hanging themselves from the bulkheads or deaths for no medical reason are not. The Shriek were no fools. Every mission saw the sensor range increased, more point defense systems deployed on the surface, more efficient tactics from the fighters. It had been a long time since the Shriek had fought such a primitive war, but that was an advantage we were fast losing. So we threw our Hail Mary and hit them with everything we had. It was codenamed X-Day. Xeno Day. It's still the 5th largest ground assault in history after all these revolutions. 8.6 million Terran soldiers packed into enough dropships to eclipse the Shriek homeworlds. More planning and strategy were poured into that landing than can possibly be remembered. More acts of bravery and accounts of sacrifice than could possibly be told. I still remember us crowded around that little radio, waiting for the crackling message from High Command just before the drop. We expected Reagan mixed with some Churchill, wrapped up in some Abe Lincoln. Want to know what we got? Burn it all. It was the most inspiring thing we'd ever imagined. We came out of the jump to a dead planet. I remember it was dark gray. Just solid gray with ash and smoke from the bombardment. I could smell it through the filters. My pilot had hit the mark. Thousands of others weren't so lucky. Come in too high, and the low-orbit defenses shredded you before you were done retching from the jump. Come in too low, and guns on the surface did the same thing. There's nothing like that abrupt perspective shift from traveling toward a planet to straight down at it. Then we started seeing flashes behind the smoke, beautiful like fireflies in the mist. But each flash was a plasma bolt from the anti-aircraft batteries. By the time we impacted the surface, we'd sustained 20% casualties. Within 4 hours, that number had risen to 70. Remember, we had no orbital cover. Our fleets were prowling the jump points and FTL lanes, harassing the massive Shriek armadas to prevent them from interfering in the ground assault. It was like an act of the devil himself. A split-second error in Shrike maneuvering that allowed a couple of the Mark IIIs to slip away from the forward relays. I can still feel the crack of the dreadnoughts dropping out of hyperspace a few miles above the surface. Still taste the slag as depleted uranium obliterated the Shriek defenses. We'd come a long way since the Mark Is. The Reapers could take a hit and had the guns to throw it back. The pair of Durasteel behemoths held their overwatch for over an hour, heedless of the planetary defenses hell-bent on ripping them from the sky. Enough time for the second wave of dropships to get their boots on the ground and establish a beachhead. The first dreadnought was forced to jump when a surface-to-air missile snuck past the point defense systems into one of the primary drive engines. The second held until the fuel tanks ran dry, jumped as they were falling toward the surface with almost 20% of their ship reduced to scrap. Later heard they had less than a dozen slugs left for the railguns. The gun crews were pissed the pilots jumped before they were empty. With our dreadnoughts making jump after jump, holding on to their sanity by threads and pumping themselves with downers to steal a few minutes sleep before injecting uppers to get themselves combat ready for the third time that day, every day. It came down to ground forces against ground forces on the Shrike homeworld. And you want to know something? We were really fucking good at it. Surface warfare was the only theater our species had ever known. We'd spent centuries honing our tactics. Other species built ships, we built better ways to slog through the mud. And this time we had some semblance of tech to back up our flesh. I can still quote it from the training. Assault Class XOK 2. Standard issue powered exoskeleton designed for strength, speed, and endurance augmentation of Terran shock troops. Average cost, 150,000 standard Terran currency units. Approximate weight on Terra, 50 to 55 kilograms. Average increased life expectancy during combat operations, 475%. One suit for one soldier, measured to the millimeter to ensure perfect reproduction of natural movement and range of motion. Dozens of microprocessors coordinate sensory input to match the soldier's actions and force accurately enough to place contact lenses in the eyes, as well as perform basic tasks, such as maintaining balance when the user is incapable. The design is such that all weight is transferred to the deck, meaning that, to the wearer, the Exo's mass should be virtually unnoticeable. The Exo was developed around a dual-power design. Electroreactive polymer controls initial movements, with response time and reaction speed, such that a Terran nervous system will effectively register zero input delay. These EAPs provide significant strength enhancements over short time frames, allowing striking, jumping, and other movements that rely on immediate power production. The primary drive system, however, is based on liquid fluid dynamics. Hundreds of lifespans of research and tech development, and yet still the highest power density and precision per cost ratio, is held by archaic hydraulic actuators. The Exo autonomously detects and reacts to the amount and duration of force generation by the wearer, switching seamlessly between both systems. This ensures movements can be both blindingly quick with exponentially greater strength a few milliseconds behind. The Exo draws power from fuel cells. Originally developed for battleships' plasma cannons, Terran tech massively reduced the size while managing to keep the reactants stable. At max draw, these fuel cells will last for 3 Terran hours, though normal combat missions estimate no less than 20 continuous hours of operation without refueling. Although actual capabilities vary with the user's size and personal fitness level, minimum acceptable specifications allow up to 70 Terran kilograms of gear without significantly impacting performance. We were Terminators relentlessly marching over their dying world, stalking through the ash of the firebombing raids. The Shriek were superstitious about their afterlife, so we covered ourselves with symbols of death. Chests stamped with the broken horns of Shriek warriors and helmets painted like grinning skulls. The raw memories of our homeworld and an aggressive propaganda campaign tore every scrap of empathy from us. We plowed over the fields and salted the earth with single-minded brutality. The surface was quickly lifeless. The Shriek were trapped within their world, within the tunnels and warrens they had constructed for just such an eventuality. They were prepared for siege, and starving them out would take centuries. At this time, we also learned of the other species scattered across the stars. Despite the tireless efforts of our fleets, we would eventually err, and a ship would sneak through the FTL lanes, or some ally of the Shrike would come to investigate the long silence. So we had to go in and take them. We softened them up first, transported the sickest, most perverted minds on Terra over, and gave them an unlimited budget and zero oversight. They started with ordnance developed for surface penetration to crack the shallow fortifications. Then they got creative. Ever seen what napalm does on a high-oxy planet? How about industrial siphons to pump out the atmo and replace it with sarin gas? And that was just the beginning. Within weeks, we had advanced past such humane methods. There was this one bunker, a couple Shrike in it were covered with chemical burns that we weren't just killing them anymore, we were making them hurt. A lot of people think the war was like World War II, what with X-Day and the tattoos on our arms. But it wasn't. Ask the guys who've been there, the guys who came back. It was World War I, except instead of trenches, it was tunnels. Old-fashioned tactics and new-fashioned combat, like when they used rifling during the American Civil War. A bunch of kids playing with tech they didn't understand. I don't think anyone who went there came back still human. The Shrike were clever, though. They have a history just as bloody as our own. Just as quickly as we invented new methods to burn them out, they designed new ways to dig deeper into their planet's shell. There was always a time when it came down to flesh against flesh. Shrike are predators. They're bigger than us, faster than us, quicker, heavier, and so strong it's barely a contest even with an exo. They're covered with armored scales and naturally armed with claws and horns. They have better senses than us, and more of them. They're a true high-grav species. Species like them are the reason us Terrans had a reputation after discovery just because of our planet. In the close confines of their burrows and warrens, the engagement distance monumentally favored their natural weapons and senses. If a Shrike gets within 10 meters of you, you're dead. Doesn't matter if you're wearing composite armor with a saw. He'll take you down with him and probably the rest of your squad before he bleeds out. And that's just one with his claws. They had rifles, grenades, mines, armor, tech. But our sickest minds had been working on that since the beginning. Genetic engineering, gene splicing, bioediting. We hunted them down with wolves, awoken from the genetic code of our domesticated pets. A code that was written when Terra was younger and far more savage than it is now. Beasts every bit as strong and quick as they were. And loyal, as only our oldest friend could be. But it wasn't quite enough. Our fleets were strained to the breaking point against the ocean of Shrike ships. We didn't have time. So they greenlit the Iron Man program. We took what the Shrike had discovered and what we learned from our dogs and created the first of the super soldiers. We took every Olympic athlete Terra ever spawned and melded their strengths into a professional executioner, gave them exos and dire wolves, then pointed them at the enemy. We cleared their tunnels and bunkers, hole by hole and pit by pit, stalking them in the dark with our devil dogs. Once they were truly defenseless, we hit them with contagion bombs, sealed them up and let them rot atop their own dead, then incinerated the corpses with orbital bombardment. It still burns under the surface. We'd done it. The Shriek were nothing more than the dregs of their species living on abandoned mining camps on the edge of the black. I wish I had been there when the first troop transport arrived back on Terra. How the people must have cheered. How the soldiers must have cried when they saw the hint of blue through the radiation shielding in the burnt sky. But you're old enough to know what happened when the soldiers started to come back. You've heard the stories. You were there when the news of what we did started to come out. Tales of men gone mad on the edge of space, consumed with vengeance on alien worlds. Do you remember when the super soldiers started to break? PTSD was the tip of the iceberg. Most of those guys couldn't sleep without bombs in the distance. They were born into a war zone and nurtured with enhanced aggression and heightened senses. They didn't know how to live back home. Slowly, Terra began to realize what we had done. They weren't the holy avengers from the propaganda mills. Public opinion began to shift. The new generation didn't remember the horrors of the Shriek research farms. They didn't know the crushing hopelessness in the face of insurmountable odds. They didn't know what we went through. Those of us still in the void had forgotten Terra. We had been born on our dreadnoughts and troop transports, issued a kinetic and exo instead of toys, fed protein blocks and vitamin pills instead of food, learned the art of war instead of attending university, killed Shrike instead of having sex. Then a few hours in a suspended animation pod before the routine began again. So when the High Command ordered our attack on the moons, we grinned, for the demons of the deep had been summoned and their devils let slip. To that day, the Shriek fleets had been almost untouched. No doubt they intended to sell their hulls dearly in their last stand, to go out in a way that would be spoken of for hundreds of revolutions. I'm sure they held no false hope, for they hadn't been resupplied in so long with our clever maneuverings, yet still, their broadsides were primed and hulls untested. I was there that turn, when dreadnought after dreadnought slid from behind the curtain of hyperspace, the jumps leeching away the light of the system's star. I saw the void going dark with the Terran fleets, saw the formations established and mass drivers angling in their gun houses as the targeting system spat out firing solutions, saw the glitter of energy beams from the Shriek capital ships and blue flares as they dissipated across the shields of our advance ranks. I tasted their despair as we didn't jump away again. I laughed as the vanguard of Mark IVs returned fire, drive engines seething crimson as they advanced. Ever seen a Revenant-class destroyer? The Mark IVs look like war feels. To us that were there on that day, they remain the most beautiful ship in the void. I can still hear our roars of applause as they closed with the enemy, caring not for the rending of their hulls, masked drivers cycling as fast as the gun crews could feed them with 1,500-kilogram, Terran-manufactured, armor-piercing, depleted uranium. If we'd been in Atmo, we'd have been able to hear the high-explosive shells screaming over us half an instant later. But we could see clearly enough on the view screen. See the rounds slamming through the breached hulls. See the capital ships rupture, venting cerulean flares of burning oxygen. The battle above lit the moons as bright as old Earth at noon, as our dropships and troop transports impacted the surface. It was a curious feeling, a mixture of excitement and fury tinged with déjà vu. Except this time there was no fear. We hit the surface this time not as the last hope for mankind, but as Terra's retribution, called forth from the deepest pits of the abyss. After all these revolutions, it remains the third largest ground assault in history. They fled from us as we stepped onto the soil. We were no longer weak and slow. Man and beast both were changed, augmented with hardware and wetware alike. Tell me, were we still Terran at that time? Still human? We slaughtered them, all of them, left their moons a barren rock and ships drifting in the cold void, then returned to our carriers and our far-orbit formations for the first time in our lives, without purpose. We reread the orders we had received a few turns before the genocide. Stand down, sue for peace, return to Terra and be rewarded for your courage and bravery. Some of us made the jump, returned home as conquering heroes and attempted to repair the shattered lives they had all but forgotten. But there were a few of us who couldn't jump home. We couldn't focus without the rumble of drive engines, couldn't eat without the counterfeit feeling of artigrav, couldn't sleep without the comfort of a rifle in a carrier bunk. Terra wasn't home anymore, and we didn't know when that had changed. It was inevitable that some had eluded our insatiable hunger. Somewhere at some time, an escape pod had slipped through the cracks, or a transport had snuck through an FTL lane. So those of us who could not return became hunters. We couldn't turn it off. Wouldn't. You can't understand. The lucky became government mercs. The unlucky became outcasts. We violated void space treaties, jumped around FTL relay checkpoints, bribed officials, invaded stations, murdered Xenos, all to kill just one more Shriek. The other species scattered across the stars learned of us through Shriek refugees and hunters' operations. Learned what we were. The war evolved into myth and legend. Every species has a first contact war, but only one species can claim the first contact war. We should have seen the warning signs as the Xenos learned of us with horror and revulsion, should have paid heed as they fortified their homeworlds and augmented their fleets. But why would we? We were the monsters on the edge of the black. Who would dare touch us? Besides, we'd found humans on a cluster of tiny moons hidden way out on the outskirts of a massive system. And when we first landed, they thought we were gods. Transcription of the First Contact War from interview with Joshua Saxton, the last of the super soldiers.